Hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. England and France. Today the two nations get along comparatively pretty well. Not always eye to eye on everything, but you could definitely say they're, overall, friends. This was not always the case. This friendship comes after over 800 years of animosity. Certainly not always at war in that time, but from the Middle Ages to Napoleon, England and France always had an eye on each other and were rarely afraid to settle their grievances the old-fashioned way. What was the reason for this bitter, endless rivalry? Well, we can consider a number of factors. Religion played a role for a while later on. After the Protestant Reformation spread across Europe in the 1500s, Catholics and Protestants overall developed hard feelings for each other, which often led to brutal conflicts from which France emerged remaining Catholic and England Protestant. The two nations also differed politically and philosophically from time to time, and when one nation was shaken up, the other felt the effects. The most obvious example of this being the widespread effects of the French Revolution, which England attempted to counter. And of course, when about any two groups of people find themselves right next to each other geographically, they tend to compete for land, power, and resources through war and conflict. England and France are no exception. But we can find examples of all of these things across the globe. What makes the rivalry between England and France unique was the competition for, quite simply, world domination. Let's back up and start at the beginning. Prior to each other, England and France's greatest enemy was the Vikings, who ravaged both of these nations while they were still evolving into the ones we know today. England, a part of an island, took the harder hit, but France suffered as well. And in 911 AD, the French king actually gave a Viking warlord named Rollo an area of land in the north to settle down in as tribute. This region became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Why am I telling you this? Because these Normans preceded the conflicts between England and France. By the middle of the 11th century, the Normans had become a mix of French and Vikings, retaining the Viking spirit for exploration and conquest, but speaking French and having adopted French culture, Christianity, and military reforms. The Duke of Normandy was technically a subject of the French king, but realistically, the Normans were an independent nation. In the year 1066, the Normans, under Duke Guillaume, invaded England, and Guillaume, better known as William the Conqueror, became King of England. This Norman conquest resulted in a lot of changes to England, in language, law, culture, etc., but most relevantly, politically, because the King of England was the Duke of Normandy, and therefore technically a French subject, tension over power became inevitable as England was drawn into the complicated politics of France of the day. In 1154, in a very stereotypically medieval situation, after a succession crisis known as the Anarchy, Henry II became King of England and Duke of Normandy, but had also, because of inheritance, already ruled these lands here as Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Anjou, and thus ruled what is referred to by historians as the Angevin Empire. As you can see, these lands cut right through France, and the rights over these lands, as well as the rights to the thrones of England and France themselves, became the source of conflict for much of the medieval era. The most notable medieval conflict between England and France was the 100 Years' War, another term invented by historians, which actually refers to 4 separate wars over the period of 116 years. England was victorious in the early phases of the war, but in the final war, the French achieved their ultimate goals, that is to say, retaining territorial integrity and political independence, and effectively won the war. The wars were very draining to both nations, but at the end of them, we see the transformation of these two into true, recognizable nation-states. However, the English were not necessarily done after the 100 Years' War, and in fact the monarch would claim the title of King or Queen of France until 1803, when it was dropped in favor of the deposed monarchy. As Europe entered the Renaissance, the rivalry between England and France did not wither, but the focus was about to change from localized squabbles to the competition to conquer the New World, or really worlds, that the Europeans were beginning to chart. Around the year 1000 AD, a group of Vikings under Leif Erikson became the first Europeans to reach the Americas. Everyone ignored this, and in 1492, the Spanish under Christopher Columbus became the first Europeans to reach the Americas. Spain and Portugal quickly became the first nations to establish settlements and claim territory in the New World of America, as well as Africa and Asia. And as time went on, the Dutch, Swedish, Russians, and of course, English and French would enter the game as well. These nations, specifically Spain, Portugal, England, and France, could realistically be called the first world powers, in the sense that they were the first nations to be able to have influence and project military power across the globe. The English and French were late to the game comparatively, but by the year 1700, it was clear that they would be the most major world players, specifically in North America and South Asia. Africa would not be heavily colonized until almost 2 centuries later. Spain and Portugal were in decline, Sweden and the Dutch had been knocked out. Russia was not heavily involved in colonization and focused more on its own contiguous territories, and the rest of Europe did not or could not make much effort toward colonization. A number of conflicts emerged in the 18th century which spilled over into other theaters, most notably, as I said, the Americas, India, and the coasts of Africa. The most important of these wars was what is called the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, where it would actually last for 9 years, from 1754 to 1763. The war remains one of the most significant in world history, as essentially an 18th century world war, leading one side, England, or more correctly at this point, Britain, and on the other, France. Hanging in the balance, the fate of the world itself. If one side decisively won here, it would affect not only Europe, not only America and India, but also even later colonization in Africa, Oceania, and the rest of Asia. In 1763, Britain emerged victorious in all theaters, and thus happily sat upon its place as the world's unchallenged top colonial power. But France was not done, and, quite unhappy about this, would later support a rebellion in the British American colonies that became the American War of Independence, which, as they intended, dealt a major blow to the British Empire. Nevertheless, the British Empire recovered and even sought out new lands like Australia and New Zealand, while the rest of Europe failed to keep up. The 18th century is sometimes referred to as the Second Hundred Years' War because the two powers were, quite frankly, in constant conflict. Following the French and Indian War, as I said, France was clearly on the losing end. And by the end of the century, economic strain related to this constant militarism was a major contributing factor to the French Revolution, which toppled the Ancien Regime and established the French Republic. At first, Britain laughed, but when events became more serious, the king and queen were executed, and the new republic established itself by defeating the major powers of Europe, Britain recognized the situation was serious. When Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew the Republican government and crowned himself Emperor of the French, it was clearly very serious. France now challenged not only Britain, but the whole of Europe, as the military genius Napoleon Bonaparte set about intending to create an empire extending across Europe. For a time, he was basically successful in doing so, but though Britain was one of his main targets, he was never successfully able to reach it. Britain was naturally Napoleon's most powerful rival and was the force rallying Europe against him. He was very nearly successful in defeating them, but following the naval battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon's plans to conquer Britain were put aside, and he focused on continental Europe instead. However, Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815. It's really around this time that, 800 years following the Norman Conquest of England, the infamous Anglo-French rivalry begins to wind down. Europe entered into a period sometimes referred to as Pax Britannica, the British peace, lasting from 1815 to 1914, in which very few major wars were fought. Britain was the world's leading power in this time and pursued its imperial ambitions. And while France did indeed build a colonial empire and remained a very powerful and influential nation, it never really challenged Britain again in the ways it had in the past. In fact, the Napoleonic Wars were really the last time Britain and France went to war with each other. From here on out, in fact, they'd be fighting on the same side, which was foreshadowed by their joint efforts in the Crimean War against Russia. And so this great rivalry started to come to a close. After 1815, the two powers started to set aside their differences and even began to work together. But why? Well, there are a number of reasons that cooperation would be strategically favorable, but the big reason, occurring in the latter half of the 1800s, was Germany. Germany, for most of its history, consisted of a collection of fragmented microstates called the Holy Roman Empire, with Austria and Prussia being the only nations within that empire capable of projecting power beyond their borders to a major extent. By the 1800s, most of the old European nations were experiencing some form of major change, including Germany. In 1871, Prussia had won the debate against Austria over who would be the master of the German lands, and then defeated France in a war, allowing the Germans to unify and evolve into the modern nation we know today as Germany. Germany wasted no time in throwing its weight around and quickly established itself as a major power. This was naturally worrying to Britain and France, and they decided it would be in their best interest to set aside their differences to prevent Germany from taking advantage of any weaknesses. The awkward, newfound friendship between Britain and France was cemented when they stood together as allies in both world wars, and continued to during the Cold War and into the modern day, as the two nations still largely find cooperation to be in their best interest, with their tense rivalries long behind them. Though the modern age has seen Britain and France work as partners, in some parts of the world, the remnants of Anglo-French enmity can still be found. The most obvious example of this is in North America, specifically in Canada. When the British defeated the French in the French and Indian War in North America, they took the majority of its mainland holdings, except for Louisiana, which was given to Spain and later sold to the United States. However, the British were not successful in assimilating the local French populations of the territory which they annexed, and these people are the people we know today as French Canadians. Historically, in Quebec and Acadia in particular, the French Canadian people have emphasized marrying only within their group, remaining Catholic, and retaining their culture and language despite external forces. Though not quite this strict these days, this resilience is why the French presence in North America did not disappear. In fact, it nearly led to a split in Canada on multiple occasions, the most famous incident being in 1995, when Quebec took a vote on its independence. The oui vote amounted to 49.42% of the population, with no amounting to 50.58%. A very close vote, and the issue is still debated to this day. A conflict stemming for almost 1,000 years, and the solutions to concerns as far back as the 1700s still, in some areas, remain unresolved and hotly debated. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, come check out some of my other stuff, and subscribe to see more informative videos in the future. I have another documentary project coming up soon, a complete history of the Roman Empire, so stay tuned for that. To help with the cost of production, Fire of Learning does take donations on Patreon, the link to which you can find in the description. Even just a $1 contribution helps to support the channel, and you'll even get your name up here with these guys. Thank you for watching.